Hey guys, today we are jamming like 7 lessons into one, and we are going to fly through some stuff, and we're going to talk about the end of the Cold War. Our objective question today is explain the reasons why the Soviet Union fell in 1991. All right, so just to kind of put us back to where we left off. Remember, JFK was assassinated. His vice president, LBJ Lyndon Baines Johnson, takes over. He's a Democrat. His plan for America is called the Great Society. We're going to see an expansion of social reform. We're going to see an expansion of civil rights. Medicaid and Medicare, both programs that are still around today, were created under the Great Society by Lyndon Baines Johnson. Also really important, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Remember, this is the legislation that JFK worked a lot with to get passed. Unfortunately, he did not live to see it. And when LBJ signs it into law, he wants everyone to know this will be JFK's greatest legacy. He wins the election that JFK had been campaigning for in Dallas when he was shot, the election of 1964. He says, listen, I know I just became president. I know you didn't technically vote for me to be president, but I'm asking you to vote for me now. He wins, huge, popular vote, gets 61%, the most any president has ever gotten. And this just reaffirms that America's confident that he'll be able to do what he needs to do. Despite the fact that he could have run again because he technically didn't get elected the first time, he does not. He steps down. This brings us into a phase of the war called détente. Remember, we started the Cold War with containment. That was Truman's policy of dealing with it. Then we used brinkmanship with Eisenhower. JFK adopted brinkmanship, altered it slightly with flexible response. And now, under the next few presidents, under Nixon and Carter especially, we're going to see détente. Okay, that's how you pronounce that word. Détente is the cooling off period of the Cold War. It's where nothing major is happening, and in fact, we actually take steps in the right direction to start kind of making a peace. After LBJ does not run again, Nixon runs. He wins. Richard Nixon, is a Republican. You remember him because he was Eisenhower's vice president. He's the first sitting president, which means he's the first person while president to go and visit China. This is important for a few reasons. One, trade between the two countries is going to accelerate. Also, U.S. tourists are going to go to China. Some Chinese are later going to come over here. And we're building a relationship. And the most important reason that Nixon goes and meets Mao Zedong is because this encourages the Soviet Union to invite Nixon as well. So the Soviet Union, our frenemy, the person we're fighting the Cold War against, has now invited our president to go and visit. And he does. Richard Nixon visits the Soviet Union and he signs the SALT Treaty. SALT I, Strategic Arm Limitation Treaty. It's exactly what it sounds like. It strategically limits the arms that we're creating between the two countries. This is a huge step in the right direction. Unfortunately for Richard Nixon, he's caught up in his biggest scandal of his presidency is the Watergate scandal. The committee to re-elect the president, acronym CREEP, was caught bugging the Democratic office. Richard Nixon, while we're pretty sure didn't really have anything to do with the initial bugging, later lied about his knowledge about it, and then it was this big cover-up and everything came to light, and it was this big deal. If we were in school, we spent an entire day looking at Watergate, but instead it's just a little blip. It becomes clear that Richard Nixon will be impeached if he remains in office, and he will be found guilty. So instead of going through the impeachment process, Richard Nixon becomes the one and only president so far to resign. He just says, all right, that's it. I'm done. His vice president, a man named Gerald Ford, becomes president. Now, Gerald Ford, he's the only unelected president, and that means he was actually not even elected as a vice president. He ended up filling a vacancy. He was selected without being voted as vice president, and then instantly becomes president when Richard Nixon resigns. He's the shortest serving president of anyone who didn't die in office. He pardons Nixon as a way to kind of help the country move on and put Watergate behind us. His domestic policy is called WIN, Whip Inflation Now. We have huge inflation in our country at this point. It's called stagflation. If something's stagnant, it means it doesn't move very much. So like stagnant water, like out in the woods and stuff, that's where like the mosquitoes and stuff are, right? Stagflation alludes to the fact that our Economy wasn't moving at all. There was huge amounts of inflation. People were waiting hours and hours in line for gas. The economy underneath Ford, even though he was only there for 895 days, was not good, which makes it easy. Oh, excuse me, I got a little ahead of myself. Not only is stagflation huge, Watergate has once again proven to the American people that they can't trust their president. Remember the credibility gap I told you about under Lyndon Baines Johnson in Vietnam, right? The idea that he was telling America, yeah, it's going great in Vietnam, it's going awesome, but then we saw on TV like Americans dying and stuff, and it was not going awesome. That's that credibility gap. That's that concept that the Americans feel like they can't trust their president. Then underneath Richard Nixon with the Watergate thing, that credibility gap widens. Now we feel more than ever we can't trust our president. We don't even trust Gerald Ford because we never even elected him. Stagflation is doing horrible. What we need is change, and that change comes with the election of 1976 with a man named Jimmy Carter. Ford runs again for the Republicans. He will remain unelected because he does not win. Jimmy Carter runs as the Democrats. Jimmy Carter's literally his campaign slogan was, "I won't lie to you." And that was all it took. That is exactly what the Americans were looking for. That's what they needed. And Jimmy Carter wins. Jimmy Carter's presidency, he's from Georgia. I'm skipping through so much stuff. It's okay. Killer rabbit, he was attacked by a killer rabbit. Panama Canal, we signed the Panama Canal over. The most important aspect of Carter's presidency was the Iran hostage crisis. We have 52 hostages that were held for 444 days. It's the longest hostage crisis in U.S. history. A lot of Americans felt that Jimmy Carter wasn't doing what he needed to be doing in order to help bring it to an end. Instead, he was kind of doing a waited out kind of thing, and people thought he should have been making more proactive steps towards ending that crisis. And this is the final nail in Jimmy Carter's presidency. He won't be able to recover this. He becomes very unpopular because of this, and that opens the door for my man. Election of 1980, Jimmy Carter runs again for the Democrats. A man named Ronald Reagan runs again. At this point, he's run for president a few times. He's been kind of under the radar, but this is his time to shine. He shows up in 1980 and says, "For real, y'all, let's do it." He gets the Republican nomination, and he wins in the biggest landslide since Herbert Hoover. Ronald Reagan was a movie star. There are his, younger pictures. Meow. And then he became a governor, and then he later, of course, went on to be president. As a Republican, as a conservative Republican, his goal is to shrink the government. His policy, at least financially, is called Reaganomics. The idea of stimulating the economy, ending stagflation, having a trickle-down effect, helping the rich people become wealthier and limit the amount of taxes they spend so they have more money to pump back into the economy. The idea is when you create tax breaks at the top of the economy, the trickle-down effect will provide more money to the lower levels of society. He wins the election of 1984. I don't have time to go over all these, but they're all pretty legit. Foreign affairs, as far as Ronald Reagan now in his, first and second term, is, of course, winning the Cold War. Right? We talked about some of the foreign things, the domestic things, right? As far as Ronald Reagan's presidency, for what we need to know is it's win the Cold War. That's what he wants to do. The Reagan Doctrine just continues to give money and support to anti-communist countries. This is something we've seen over and over again with other presidents we've talked about. He does pitch the idea of Star Wars. That kind of fizzles out, of course. There's a war in Afghanistan between, hang on. I think I have a slide on that. I'll come back to that. And then the Iran-Contra affair, the most controversial aspect of Reagan's presidency for sure. There we go. End of détente is when the Soviets invade Afghanistan, and the American troops send in reinforcements to help the Afghan troops. The war goes on for quite a while, and this is just going to prove to Ronald Reagan that what we need to be doing is more. We need to be competing with the Soviets again. The détente is over. The cooling down time has gone away. The idea of making peace with the Soviets has now proven to not work. Instead, we need to become more competitive, continue to crank out what we can do, and know that the Soviets won't be able to keep up. And that's exactly what ends up happening. The reason the Soviets end up driving their country into the ground, there's a couple major reasons, right? One of them is they're trying to compete with us. The Cold War, by extension, is a bunch of other wars. It's proxy wars, where we're fighting in places like Korea and Vietnam and Afghanistan, where we're not directly fighting each other, but we're fighting through others. Another race that's going on is the space race, of course, which we win, allegedly, because we got to the moon first. And then there's also the arms race. We're mass producing these weapons. And the SALT I and II treaties ended up kind of reining that back, but now we're doing that again. Also, a lot of these secondary countries that are extensions of the Soviet Union, these puppet regimes they've set up to be independent communist countries, they all report back to the Soviet Union. It's very clear that they're just extensions of the Soviet Union. Well, now people in these areas are saying, why are we reporting back to you? Why can't we be our own country? And they're starting to push back as well. Also, the whole idea of communism, you can fight me to the death, right? Communism has proven to not be very effective, right? So there's a variety of reasons why the Soviets are struggling. However, they do try their best to keep their head above water for as long as they possibly can. Their new leader, Gorbachev, is going to come up with two policies that are going to attempt to keep the Soviet Union afloat. The first one is glasnost, which just means more openness, okay? And I'll talk more about that in just a second. The second word, this one's a little scary, but we can do it. Perestroika. Perestroika is free market. It's taking them from a complete communist country and sliding them down that spectrum from less on the left side towards center, right? Becoming a little bit more socialist instead of full-on communist. And we're just going to slide that political spectrum just a little bit. So anyway, glasnost. It's more freedom. It's more openness, all right? Gabby Taylor told me this. She goes, you know how I remember glasnost? And I was like, hit me, Gabby. What do you got? She said, glasnost is because a window's glass and it's more open and you can see through a window. And I said, girl, if that helps you, go on with it, right? So glasnost, more openness. It's freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, so people can express themselves more. It's taking them from a full-on communist country and moving them, a little bit looser. Perestroika, free markets, private businesses. It's taking them from a full-on communist country and making them a little bit more open as well. Both of these are ways that the Soviet Union is becoming more like us in order to continue to compete with us. Now, one of Ronald Reagan's most famous speeches, his Tear Down the Wall speech, he gives that in 1987 in Berlin. He says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. This speech is meant to say, listen, if communism is as great as you think it is, if the Soviets are as happy as you say they are, why do we still have these physical boundaries? Why don't we all become more open? Why don't we all become more friendly? And why don't you tear down this Berlin Wall? Remember that Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain that had descended over Europe, right? It's the physical boundary between the democratic freedom and the communist, right? And so Ronald Reagan knows exactly what he's doing when he challenges the Soviets to tear down the wall, and eventually they do. When all is said and done, the Soviets, the puppet regimes, right, that the Soviet Union had taken over and said they were their own independent countries, they grew ideals of nationalism and stuff, and they eventually became free. They started their own governments. Eventually, the Berlin Wall is torn down. The year is 1991 when that finally happens. And with this, America ends up winning the Cold War. Remember, the reason the Cold War took place between us and the Soviets is because by the end of World War II, we were the only two remaining superpowers. And now we've outlasted the Soviet Union as well, which means that at the end of the Cold War, America is the one and only superpower remaining. Now, that's no longer true, of course, but at that point, we were on an all-time high. So does America win the Cold War? I would say yes. Right, because literally the country we were fighting disappeared. So, and then of course, the Soviet Union becomes Russia again, and we're familiar with that, right? This is when the Soviet Union disappears. All right, I'm so sorry we had to do that so fast. This is like my favorite part of this unit, and we kind of jammed it all into about 14 minutes when we could have talked about it for about 2 weeks, but we got to do what we got to do. Alrighty, make sure to answer your objective question. I will see you later. Bye-bye, guys.